Now, up to this point, excuse me, obviously I allow my players a degree of latitude. Obviously I allow them a degree of choice. And other than the base choice of grouping up, I had basically told them, if whatever you want to do will be allowed within reason, right? Because that's something I'm big on. That being said, it was both logical and reasonable to assume they would follow a certain path up to the point that I'm about to reach here, because everything had been laid out in a logical, progressive manner. The only real options were to turn around or go forward. Really, when you think of it in character, I mean, obviously, if you wanted to think of it not in character, you could be like, I'm gonna go just sit here on this spot for the next 3 days. But that's not actual freedom, really, when you get down to it. That's just my players being silly. No, everything they had done up to this point, up to the point we're about to reach, had been pretty much laid out, and then at this point, they could do basically whatever. There were no immediate quest hooks. There were plot hooks, certainly, several plot hooks, and a great deal of long-term motivations put in within the party members, especially Fiona Seal, but no immediate quest hooks. Well, what happens is after they finished within the Shadow Room, they continued forward and encountered a long hallway, rather long actually. Along this hallway were three sections where it was as though the I should probably have the camera up so I don't blitz the thing out because the camera's really weird if you get all black. Like instead of if this is the walls here, again, like the walls had merged in to form a doorway, right? And these had been crudely and roughly blasted open with just pure magical energy. They didn't even stop to examine why. I guess it doesn't really matter anyways. But regardless, clearly just as they went through, all three of them were like this. After they passed the third one, they started to notice something on the ground after a couple of successful awareness checks. They found traces of dried blue blood. Now, for those of you who are not aware, Fiona Seal, and logically scions in general, bleed blue. This got them like, okay. And they continued forward, a little more cautiously now, and came to the entrance of a very large room, several hundred feet on all sides, kind of formed like this, if you follow me. That would be a six-sided room, but that's mostly square-based. And at the very end of it was a woman of some sort who looked like a scion, who was sobbing quietly to herself. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she had several gashes and wounds all over her that were bleeding onto the ground. Blue blood, of course. There were also several dozen little black clouds that were surrounding her on the floor. They were not hovering up like this. They were right there on the floor. Each one of these was like a smoky, oily. Any of you out there who have seen really thick charcoal smoke or coal smoke, actually, for that matter, really really dark, thick black cloud, just kind of hovering there. Dozens of these, or about a dozen actually, of these things, just kind of doing this thing, and occasionally a little shot of lightning would go through it. Violet lightning. Now, they decided to try and approach her diplomatically, which doesn't surprise me. But in so doing, they startled her, and thus initiative was rolled. Now, I find visualizing this battle very amusing because of the way it progressed. What happened was she got to go first, and so she's there. She's like, "Leave me alone in my agony," and just pouring all of this black ooze energy, shadow power into her hands, and that was her round. She spent her round going, building up this energy. Flux moved in to attack her. Didn't actually make it all the way. Like I said, it's a large room. And Fiona Seal used her sniper crystal diamond, whatever I called it, ability, where, she generates the massive crystal spike that then impales her, and impaled her so hard she actually got pushed further back up against the wall, into the wall, and was impaled here through her shoulder like this. But she didn't actually stop channeling, and so she shoves it all out, and a massive wave of black and violet energy went screaming across the room. Flux barely managed to dodge it. Fiona Seal got hit full blast, took quite a bit of damage. At this point, Flux finally got this idea kind of out of nowhere. He had This is really weird how this progressed in game terms too. I have a rule. It's not actually a rule. If you don't want to, you don't have to. But for fun, I like people to describe crits. How did this crit happen? So he crits. Now he used his long range ability and steel body and merged with his aspect. So he was fully buffed. He was ready to, loaded for bear. And for the next 5 rounds was basically death walking. And so he crits her and decides because it's bludgeoning damage, he could go ahead and have it be subdual. So he decides basically out of nowhere to turn it into subdual damage, and as he rushes up to hit this woman with this for something like 60 at level 2 subdual damage, he yells back to Fear Seal, or he yells at her, we're not here to hurt you, we're not here to stop you. At which point Fear Seal probably gets the point of what they're going for, decides to go ahead, and he goes ahead and manages to pull the spike out, so she is no longer being impaled and bleeding blue all over the place. Um, I don't actually remember what her next turn was. I apologize for not doing a complete blow by blow here, but the net result is Fear Nacil ran across and tried to embrace her, hug her, tried to comfort her, but unfortunately her thoughts were of panic and fear and worry, and so it didn't quite succeed. It did partially succeed, and she kind of went limp in her arms. And all those little black clouds I mentioned, the dozen or so, suddenly swooped out and started making this little vortex whirlwind thing over here. I guess I should do it like this. And then merged into a rather large thing. Looked just like I just mentioned. Except for the fact that there was I actually described it. It had a lot of horrible features. I don't remember the specifics right now, but it looked horrifying, and it looked like it was only partially physical, if you understand my meaning. Now, then Flux critted again because he just has the crit dice, I swear. And mind you, I was watching. He's not cheating or anything. I saw the dice roll over to 20, and it's like, wow, dude, really? So he crit the thing again, and then he crit the thing again. No, actually, no. He missed like 3 times, and as Fear Nacil was trying to do whatever she could. Oh, she also Fear Nacil activated her healing whirlwind in order to heal both the woman and herself because she had been actually rather grievously wounded. She actually went to about half health prior to this. Um, the thing sent out a black shockwave, which nobody was able to dodge by any means available to them, which just hit everybody in the entire facility, including the woman, for quite a bit of damage. That was, of course, healed within the next round because she was still doing the whirlwind thing. And they managed to defeat it rather quickly, all things told. What happened then I will describe specifically. The black clouds re-emerged, so there's still the dozen or so, and they all went soaring through one of the walls. And a couple minutes, maybe a minute, 60-ish seconds later, what happened was the woman, who I never named, for obvious reasons, she didn't exactly, hi, my name's Bob, and I'm here to kill you. No. The woman went limp and let out a really relieved sigh, just oh, thank God, and died. Um, there is one other thing I would like to note. In this 60-second period, they had a couple of chances to react. Obviously, Fiona Seal was just holding her, trying to comfort her. Flux had done several healing checks to try and heal her up and determine what's going on. They did heal her to full health, but all the wounds she had prior to the battle were still there and were not healing. And he informed Fear Nacil that in his professional opinion, they were a physical manifestation of a deeper wound, either of her heart or soul, what have you. But then she sighed and died in her arms. Now, Fear Nacil was disconsolate to the point of incapable of action over this, and for reasons that should be fairly obvious. At this point in time, she, within the space of about a grand total of a day, has discovered that she has a people at last, but the ones that she actually sees have been brutally murdered. The rest were wiped out in an instant by something she doesn't know. And, oh, by the way, the players decided to affix a name to this event, and they have decided on Cataclysm. So from now on, I'm going to refer to that as the Cataclysm. A great cataclysm happened which wiped out millions of her people, and now she has finally, for the first time, encountered one flesh and blood, for real, alive, and she died in her arms. So she spends the next several hours sobbing. Flux decides that he spends several minutes. We actually ended the first session, the first session right here, because it was a rather impacting scene, and both the players were like, oh my god level. Just okay, yeah. I don't even know what to do next. Let's just pause here because even the players were emotionally affected by this scene, and which was kind of the intent. The next thing that happened is Flux, after several minutes had passed, decided to examine the room they were in. I haven't described it yet because of the events of the fight, but this large room, there have been panels I've been describing this whole time, made of a certain, or coated, depending on the circumstances, of a certain material, which is what they use for everything, for magical communication, information, storage, that sort of thing. And this whole room is lined with panels of that same bronzish, yellowish material, which by the way the players don't know, they don't recognize it, and it has been gashed and gutted rather crudely, as though someone just literally took a knife and was just like all over the place. Flux decided to do something that hadn't actually occurred to me and took 20. And so he spent 3 hours repairing this place very carefully and meticulously with his weaving, while Fiernacille slowly tried to gather herself from her grievous mental and emotional wounds over the last day. 3 hours passed, and it's funny too because at the time it didn't occur to me to mention that he might actually have a time limit on things, because that's not the way I think, to be honest with you. But his assumption was that he was in no rush to be anywhere, which is funny given what I'm going to go into shortly. But let's move on. Having repaired the place, and having spent so much time so intimately involved with it and with the workings thereof, he determined that Mandakir was a genius. This specific device would only work in the specific type of location of this island. You see, what it is he crafted a small sphere of this material, whatever it is, and placed it directly in the center of the island. Okay, this sphere was directly channeling a very light amount, just a tiny little amount of elemental earth energy directly from the ley line through the facility, okay? So the facility needs to be powered for this thing to be powered as well. That's important, and it'll be important later. This thing then sends out, it's not actually a ping, because a ping is, this is a continuous wave. One of my players referred to it as a blanket. So here, let's do a visual representation here. Rather than a wave, which would be, like this one wave here, and there's another wave here, it is a continuous stream of material here. There we go. Such that, as I blank out my webcam, such that it is basically continuously blanketing the entire island in this energy, and it is then interpreted by this massive room, which took months to construct, in order to present totally controllable, near perfect visual records of the entire island and the surrounding waters. To say this is a boon would be saying, putting it mildly. Originally, I wasn't even sure they were going to be able to repair this thing at all, but he did manage a 47 with his taking of 20. um, so they had this wonderful scene I feel like sharing, if you don't mind, where Flux finally has finished his work and he's determined what it is. He shares it with Fiernacille, and then he pauses. The player paused as he was describing this in character, and he says to Fiernacille, his sister, "Do you want to put this off? Do you want to wait?" Because he knows she's been through some horrifically traumatic things, and one of the first things they want to do. By the way, this place records information. It's not just now. They can go back and look at anything this thing has ever recorded, as long as it's still intact. And he determined that there was some damage. I'll get to that later. But in general, the idea here is that we're about to see firsthand what happened, probably. Are you sure you're up for this? And the way she responded was beautiful. She basically says, no, I don't want to. I don't want to watch them die. I don't want to watch them be alive. I don't want to see my people walking and talking and being happy. But I need to. And I like that. I like that a lot. And so they finally decided to go ahead and turn it on. Now I'm going to do the best I can to relay everything that they learned, because there is quite a bit. The device was first made active and started recording um, just over 8 months prior to the Cataclysm, okay? This was after all three facilities had already been built, and there was no the first thing they did was they kind of scanned the island. Now it is semi-visual, but there is a way they can be like, I'm looking for anything of blah nature here. One of the first things they noticed was that there were scions everywhere, not just in the three facilities, but all over the place on the island, all over Visay and LaSalle. And they were like, "Oh, okay, interesting." And they determined that, well, okay, let's move on. Um, there were some basic limitations for the system. It had no audio, none, zero zip zilch, and you could not always see certain things because it is it's basically angled. You have the perspective from the center of the island. Now you can zoom in and move around as much as you can, but like I said, it is near perfect. You cannot rotate because your perspective is the same. You follow me? So they couldn't get absolutely everything, but they could get a tremendous amount of information, and they could pause it, slow it down to the thousandth of a second. The next thing they noticed very quickly, I might add, is that there were a lot of humans and elves and dwarves. These three species were present throughout the island, mostly humans, but still. And they were working with, or for, or however you want to put that, the scions. Now I'll go into that interaction a bit more because they spent some time studying this. But it was important to note that they were there at all. Another thing to note is that there were no, while several of the buildings were there that were 400 years ago that are there now, not very many, but some, there were no clearly defined border lines. There were no houses. The three houses weren't present, and there was no military to speak of, zero. Also, there were only scions within the three facilities. No non-scions existed within any of the three facilities within the mountain, okay? Um, One final note, I've described this island before, circle of the waterfall, which goes several hundred meters up, there's the island, and then there's the pillars, right? The perfect sphere that this thing presents in its scanning radius actually goes out past the waterfall by a couple of miles, actually, in all directions. Again, a perfect sphere. So, which they found interesting, and also it likely has to do with the fact that this place was never designed to be the original It goes out to the extent of the magical barrier that was preventing this place. After that point, it just stops dead, and they can tell that. And it is likely that barrier was so far out because they never intended this place to be physically sunk, as I mentioned earlier. They started watching the interactions of the individuals, trying to get some signs of the culture, the people, and what was going on. And they started to notice things were very odd. At first, it just seemed like the humans, let's just say humans, because that's the primary race involved here, were deferring to the scions. But after very thorough examination, spending like another half hour or so looking over these records for this 8-month period, they found that the humans, I'm just going to summarize their findings. The humans were a slave race. They were not subjugated in the sense that they were, whips and everything like that. Rather, they were most likely being directly controlled in some manner. They had slightly blank faces. There was no signs of rebellion, no signs of dissent. There were no police force of any kind. There was no SS. There was no enforcement. There was no labor camps. There was nothing. These people were completely peacefully, yet, however, totally subjugated. Okay. Fiona Sale didn't care for that. I don't blame her. The next thing that they determined was that the scions had some kind of mental communication both with their slaves and with each other, because a lot of time they would see scions obviously conversing and yet their mouths weren't moving, if you follow me. And for example, a scion would be overseeing the construction of a building, and they could watch that. And the humans and the dwarves, in some cases, and elves, in some cases, would be actually doing the mundane tasks of getting the brick and mortar and everything in place, while the scion is watching, basically unmoving, until finally they're done, and he moves forward and actually starts weaving the specific details. Okay. Now, I described the attitude that the scions present themselves physically, the way they walk, the way they are is seen in public and in private, as the founders from the Dominion, okay? For anybody who doesn't know what I'm talking about, one of the true defining features of these people was the fact that they genuinely believed this wasn't, they weren't after power for power's sake. They weren't perpetuating a lie because it would advance their purpose. They genuinely believed with all their being that they were superior and that they should rule, that was the proper order of things. Now, that is the same atmosphere that these scions were showing, basically constantly, even down to the individual. Now, there was nothing else really of note, I don't think, until we get to the event, the Cataclysm. Now, there are a couple things they noted about the Cataclysm. Number one, it hit every scion on the entire island at the same moment. Number two, when I say the same moment, I mean it. Down to the thousandth of a second, every single scion on that island vanished in a whoosh of white light, basically instantaneously, within the space of a few thousandths of a second. Now, a couple of additional details here. Um, Again, I want to stress everything happened at the same time. So this whatever happened was not a shockwave of some sort, was not perpetuated by certain thing, and again, there was no signs that it was going to happen. That it's exactly the same all the way across the island. Um, they decided to focus in on a couple specific areas at the moment it hit, just to see what was going on. If you'll recall, there were several hundred. I decided 800. 800 scions in the pods back in the first facility. They decided to watch them because they were still there in the present. Dead, obviously, but you know. What happened to them after some knowledge rolls based on what they were seeing, they believed that what happened was some elemental earth energy coursed through them at the moment the cataclysm hit, but they didn't vanish, they stayed there. Furthermore, to fully confirm one of their suspicions, they've focused in on a specific spot within the second facility. I mentioned they found a piece of decayed or drained materia, which was supposed to be impossible, and they decided to focus on the spot where that materia was found, and they saw the gentleman who had the materia infused in him at the time, and as he vanished, the materia plopped down to the ground, drained. And so, in their minds, and with good reason, that was confirmation that whatever this cataclysm was, it had successfully drained or destroyed the the natural magical essence of the materia, as well as the magical essence of whatever magical equipment anyone had on, which is still supposed to be impossible, but I just thought I'd mention it. The next interesting point is the fact that the recording only goes for a little under an hour after the cataclysm. It starts to fade out, and as they replayed it and figured out, as I mentioned, the facility has the energy powering this the sphere, which is giving these images, is powered through the facility. The facility itself is powered by the people. With no people there, with no scions powering it, it just kind of slowly ran out until finally it could function no more. And it lasted for a full hour because, and I'll mention this because this will become more apparent later, they had sufficient numbers to have a dirge of surplus, a surplus. There we go. They had a surplus of energy going, so the readings could continue for some time. The next interesting thing, and this is something that, as I've already mentioned, they deduced earlier, or rather they deduced after they learned this. I just mentioned it to you, the viewers, earlier, was that all the people, all the humans who were left, looked very confused. Now, I stress that because they did not look afraid, they did not look overjoyed, they did not look relieved, they simply looked confused. And the players didn't quite get the point until I gave them a gimme where I told them that, let's say they were glancing through, just kind of going through human households or whatnot, trying to figure out what's going on, and they found one where a mother and a child were, and they rewound the playback to where, just before the cataclysm, where the mother and child were interacting, playing, doing whatever. Let's say like a 12-year-old, I believe I decided on. And then the cataclysm hit, and then the two looked at each other like they didn't even know each other. And they watched them over the course of the next period of time, and they were arguing, and what the heck is going on, kind of thing, or at least they surmised that because no audio, and then finally started to have signs of recognition before the video finally cut out. Based on all this, they had a rather interesting picture of what happened. Obviously, still no real information about what happened, and the two players spent some time spitballing and theory crafting about what happened. Did this hit every scion on the planet? Did it just hit the bounds of this island? Did it hit the other islands in addition to this one? Where did it come from? Why did it happen? What could cause such a massive thing on such a genocidal scale? So many questions, but unfortunately, there were very few real answers for these kind of questions. But at the very least, they finally understood the full scope and scale of what had happened and what role it had played in the foundation of the culture of this island. Moving on. They then decided to go to the next piece of data. Now, this is interesting because my players didn't find this interesting at all. Everything that has been happening has been revolving around what I called the day zero. I already mentioned that in my first video. So I imagine their assumption was that the video would start up when that happened. It did not. It started up a full 4 days before that happened, before the magical outlash, before the people in the pods were murdered. Now, all of this portions of this playback were half destroyed or completely destroyed. They literally only got a couple minutes of playback over the next 10 days, or yes, 10 days total, I believe, or maybe it's 5 days. I'm sorry, I'd have to figure it out. But anyways, total playback at all. And so they got a few bits and pieces. A very tall man, almost 9 feet tall, who was dressed in extremely elaborate red robes that were done up in gold filigree all over the place with very, very fancy designs and whatnot, walked into the facility, okay? Now, I mentioned that specifically because he didn't teleport in to the pad. He physically entered this place. Now, what happened next is Flux, or that is to say, the person who plays him, then rolled knowledge politics, which amused me so much I just gave him the intro because I never in a million years imagined that they would ever do that, and I wasn't going to give it to them. He identified with his knowledge politics a stylized form of the House Lelu crest within the filigree within his gold on his red robes. It was clearly not the modern crest, the one that he knew from House Lelu, but it was one that he had recognized before from effectively from 4 centuries earlier, based on the other information they had found. I can't believe he thought about that. I really never figured that he'd figure that out so quickly. It was awesome. Anyways, so they saw him entering the area, and he had this thing going on to the point where you actually couldn't see his face, right? And that might be fuzzy. I apologize if there's any sound problems for that. Um, and so he walked through the facility. The next thing they saw was him weaving certain parts of that first facility. I mentioned way back then that some parts were much more crudely made. He was in some of those rooms, basically reshaping them, reforming them for some purpose or some point, trying to do something there. They of course have no idea what. I don't think they even theorized. They were just listening attentively. But he was, doing his thing. I probably spent several days because the next reading was from day zero. The event where he is in the pod room, smashing every single pod, 800 of these, individually, going through with a knife, a very fancy knife, I might add, with lots of gold and gems in it, so not really practical, but nevertheless sharp, and slitting their throats one by one, every single one of them. They didn't see that whole event because that actually took quite a while, obviously, but they did see a few scenes, which Fear Seal didn't take very well. And then the next thing they saw was, what was the next thing? Give me just a second. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Uh, it's been a long day. What was the next thing they saw? He was there. Right. The next thing they saw was actually about an hour-ish later within the research facility. He was dragging the young woman from earlier, the one they defeated, kicking and screaming, but not actually at him. In other words, this woman probably had no actual recognition of the fact that he existed. That's important. She didn't realize that he was there or that he was dragging her, and the injuries he'd inflicted upon her were something that she probably had no recollection of. She was just thrashing wildly because of well, they don't know why, but there's many reasons that could be. And then he flings her down onto the floor. And yes, she's fully clothed before anyone asks. Flings her down on the floor in the middle of the observatory room, the place where they're actually watching these events, and starts ranting and raging, and he is just very animated, and he is just, you can tell that he's shouting at the top of his lungs at this woman who doesn't even recognize he exists. And finally, at the end of it, he pulled out the knife and started gutting several parts of the wall, and at the very end of it, put his head up to the wall and started erasing bits of his being here, which is why they were only able to recover some of them. It is in that last moment that, and this was the high roll, if they had gotten a 40 or higher, I had decided, they would get this last bit of information, because this is crucial, that he actually got to see his face, because it had become dislodged, and his face was that of a scion. Even though he was 9 feet tall and clothed in a way that they'd never seen any other Scion clothed. He was of the same race as the Scions. Now, with all this information, they were like, okay, and they digested for a bit, and they're like, all right, let's start looking at the now. Let's start looking at the situation as is. And they started looking across the island in kind of a bird's eye view, kind of literally, in real time. Not no recording. This is just what's actually happening on the island right now. They determined two things very quickly, and as they started zooming in, they started remembering what the situation was before they entered these sanctuaries. That is to say, Telvanni was about to start a land grab against House Redoran. There were several units of Telvanni. There are several units of Telvanni troops on the border. They haven't actually moved yet, but simply by being there, they are following the Articles of Warfare and are approaching with the intent of a land grab. And if they are not opposed by some military force of any kind, which can include the party members, by the way, then they are legally within their right to claim that territory and however much territory they feel like in the name of House Telvanni, according to the Articles of Warfare. That's not the big news, though. As they looked further south, they noticed that on the Telvanni border with Hlelu in the southwest part of the island, there was a huge series of encampments where large numbers of mercenaries were gathered, a very large army, easily double the size of the Telvanni one. And they were just kind of sitting there hanging out, ready to go. And that put them a little bit curious, so they zoomed out again and started looking around, and they discovered a armada, is what I'm going to call it, because calling this thing a fleet isn't really acceptable. Granted, by modern times, or even the nations that exist on the mainland, this fleet is not too large, but within the confines of this island, there's only been one other point in history where a fleet this large has been gathered. And that is when all three houses put together a single fleet as a joint effort in order to try and find a way to get past the waterfall, and no individual ever came back from that, by the way. Moving on. They see this massive armada of Hlelu ships, which are posted in such a position that they would not be seen from the shore, from Redoran's shore, and they do some basic information and calculations, and they determine that that fleet has enough rations and supplies and materials to stay there for about another day, and will take them about another day in order to get back to shore. Which means whatever they're about to do, either to launch an assault on Redoran or return to Hlelu ports, is going to be done within the next day. Probably a lot sooner than that, actually, because, travel time and all that. This is why I mentioned earlier that, they weren't aware of any time crunch, except technically there was one, but I didn't want to be unfair or unkind, and obviously this wasn't me trying to punish them for taking their time. It's just the nature of the world. Like I said many, many times, the world is moving even if they are not. So they decide to focus in on Iron Ridge Citadel, which is the capital, the capital fortress of the House Redoran. And they look around the citadel, trying to find someone they trust because they have a plan. Okay, this is a wild plan. I can't believe they thought of this, which is ironic because I did think of this, but moving on. And they find an interesting sight. In one of the war rooms is Lieutenant Cowell, who is their direct superior officer within House Redoran, a major who is nameless, one of the majors of House Redoran, Ariana, who was a party member, if you'll remember, and is a fairy and a member of a diplomat from the mainland, and Lieutenant Maxim, who was the former Telvanni agent who they rescued in like the first session way back when. All these four people are around a war map which is showing the Telvanni troops. They know they're there, and they also show that Redoran troops are being moved south to respond to this. There is no sign of anything that Hlelu's doing. Naturally, they come across this plan. Okay, we need to get them a message somehow. Somehow, we need to get a message to them, and they devise this idea. What we're going to do is we're going to latch on to some part of that room, and there was a part. Well, actually, there's several parts, but like there's a pedestal, or no, I'm sorry, a pillar, and that was part of this original construction of that building, because Iron Ridge Citadel, in some fashion, was there 400 years ago when the Scions were prolific on this island, and which makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because the people have only had 2 centuries or so in order to build up. But anyways, moving on, because they also experienced a Dark Age period a little over 200 years ago, but that's getting into history. Let's not get into that. They spent this time, so they're looking at this pillar, and they're like, okay, we want to resonate with that pillar. We want to this little orb is sending out constant elemental energy. We want to force an audio, just a blip of audio through that, and they think about this and they're like, okay, we think we can get just a couple of seconds in this. I gave them 5 seconds based on their roll, based on their skill roll, of audio that they could get through to this pillar. Okay. Now, this is interesting. They didn't actually know this until they attempted it. But what they're doing is they're speaking through the elemental earth ley line itself. Now, if you'll remember, Ariana has the unique ability amongst fairies to physically see elemental energy, and that is an ability very unique to herself. And so, if she had not been there, this would not have worked at all. Yes, I do plan things out quite in advance. Thank you for asking. Um, so, and it really was just a just in case because I didn't think they'd actually think about this. But hey, awesome. Um, so they decide to get, and I love this. One of the guys got out his phone and got a little app, a countdown app, 5 seconds, and let out a little beep when 5 seconds had passed. And they started practicing because obviously the characters in character are practicing what they're saying so that when the time comes, because they only get one shot of this, by the way. There's no way to repeat this. There's no way to send repeated things, and I'll mention the main reason why in a second. But I told them up front, you get one shot. And they were like, okay, we know this. Our characters know this. We get one shot. All right, let's make this work. And they practiced it out for some time. They finally got off a message. Unfortunately, I don't remember the exact wording because they spent quite a while refining this message. But essentially, it was, we will handle the Tavani. There's a Hlelu Armada coming from the north. It needs to be dealt with. Something along those lines, basically. And I'm trying to think. I think those were the only real bits of info that they managed to get across. Now, if you'll remember, the original mission that Lieutenant Cowell had sent these two characters, Fiona Seal and Flux on, was a form of reconnaissance about a land grab from Telvanni. I mention that because it's very important, because it is extremely likely that if, for whatever reason, a message from them got to them saying, ignore the Telvanni, Hlelu's coming, they would take it seriously, and they would treat it as if it was genuine military info. You follow me? Now, the catch here is when they sent the message and it went through and they were watching because they got about 3 minutes I decided to give them of information as they're watching this room. Ariana, of course, turns to the pillar and is like, huh? They successfully rolled an awareness check to notice that Lieutenant Cowell also reacted. I mentioned that they haven't said anything about that, and I don't blame them. We were getting kind of late in the night at this point. They were probably pretty tired. But Lieutenant Cowell also reacted for some reason. Now, Ariana actually walked over to the pillar and was like, and I loved it because one of the guys was like, oh, come on, figure it out, please. And I went ahead and I was like, all right, this is going to be a roll. This is going to be a roll on her part, and I did the roll. And she succeeded, and she's like, oh, okay, okay. And so she relays this information to Lieutenant Cowell, who comes over and is like, and obviously they can't hear what they're saying, but they could see a discussion going on between the two. And Ariana goes over to the map and starts pointing towards the northwest portion where the ships are, even though they're not on the map on the war room, obviously. And the major comes over and is like, and the guy's like, and I give them another awareness roll, and they noticed that Lieutenant Maxim, who was over in the corner, kind of talking over the thing, looked a little disturbed, a little concerned, which made sense to them because they figure if Hlelu is making a move, it's bad for Telvanni just as much as it is bad for Redoran. So shrug. They did notice that one, and they speculated on that one just fine. And then the power went out, and not the power literally. I mean the power of this orb went out because, and it occurred to them immediately afterwards that the excess energy they had to put into sending that message took up all of its resources for quite a while, and it would be quite a while, about an hour I decided actually out of character, before it managed to power itself back up again. This left them with no map, no holographic map, no way to look at what's going on now anymore, and a lot of decisions to make. Now, they haven't actually decided what they're going to do yet, but it is very clear that they're in a great deal of a hurry to do something. While both characters have a genuine desire to leave the island and figure out what's going on, seek out this murderer, and bring him to justice, both of them want very badly to kill this guy, which is awesome. I've succeeded rather well on that, I think. And to figure out what happened so many centuries ago to their people, or to her people, I should say. And so many other things like that. But right now, the impetus is we need to fix this problem, and both of them are thinking long-term problems. There's also a lot of complications here, which I'd like to share with you if you don't mind. As I said, I have no idea where they were going next, but I brought up several of these to them, and we discussed this after the session was over, just to make sure everyone was clear on the full implications here. This facility is so far advanced and so far beyond and so much more advanced than anything that they have technologically or magically that handing the keys to anyone on the island, handing the keys of this place to anyone on the island is something both dangerous and risky. And the question was levied, would we trust Redoran with this, our own house with this? And the answer was no. The idea Flux has had, and he shared this with Fear Nacil, and the two of them agree on this, is they want to form a covert agency. I shouldn't call it a covert agency. He likened out of character, he likened it under the Rangers, and yes, that applies to both Lord of the Rings and Babylon 5 for obvious reasons. An elite group of people who are not interested in political alliances or provincial ends, but simply are interested in doing what is best for the better good of everyone involved. People that they can be trusted with the keys to Cthulhu's workshop. Now, so they're going to start working on that as soon as they have the availability to. I believe they're going to be heading south to the Telvanni to try and, with them by themselves, present a military response. And they may. I have no idea what they're going to do there. Honestly, they haven't discussed their plans with me, but that's the intent. I've told them they'll probably make it in time before the fleet does whatever. I actually sat down and figured out the hours. They actually have about a 2-hour gap between one way or the other. I think I'll decide that on a roll. And the other problem is, it is very possible that in the way this facility works, only a scion can truly access it, right? Which means only Fear Nacil can truly access it. Now, that's kind of a problem because she wants to leave, and opening this place up in a permanent manner, which is something within their capacity, means opening it up to everybody. They could try reweaving a way to only have access for other people, but that's also going to be a role. So the problem this facility poses is great, and it has probably occurred to my players more than once, basically to not mention this place to anybody. Obviously, Ariana and Alexander both know about it. Out of character, they haven't mentioned to anybody because they have brains, and they know that mentioning something like this that is advanced even for the mainland, which is ahead of in technologically and magically of the island, would probably not be a good idea. Final thoughts. I'm sorry for kind of wrapping this up like this, but this we with this video I have not caught up to now. This is as recent as I've gotten. The last session I'm talking about happened today, the same day I'm doing this recording. And I'm really excited about what's going to happen next, and I'm rather curious what direction they're going to go in. I did ask Flux to tell me a specific point of information, or I'm sorry, the guy who plays Flux, when exactly his character has made the decision. Okay, it is now that I'm going to leave the island, and he has agreed that it is not yet, which is good. And they both come. Oh, I'm sorry. There's one other thing. They both come to a bit of a consensus that for them to feel safe leaving this island, Hlelu has to be dealt with on a more permanent level. They've been doing horrible things for a long time, and they haven't had the means to do anything about that on a wide scale until now, because now they have access to this facility and more or less the run of it. And they can use its technology and its capacity, and if nothing else, this frickin' scanner, which is near perfect real-time information, in order to get an edge on Hlelu and finally do something with it, and try to bring Hlelu down. So we'll see what happens next. Either way, I am rather looking forward to it, and I will talk to you guys next time.